those letters on the dreidel, it means a great miracle happened here. And with every Hanukkah candle they light, the Jewish people remember the most important message of all, that religious freedom belongs to everyone, and that we can be a light in the world. That is our story for today. Let's sing our children out to the religious education class. Running out is excitement for the program, not eagerness to get away from it. I love that they run to their classes. They enjoy it. So our reading this morning was written by a Unitarian Universalist minister, the Reverend Lynn Unger. And I'm going to read it through it twice. And what I'd like you to do the first time is to really pay attention to whatever phrase or word or image catches at you. And then during our time of meditation, ask yourself, why? Why did that image, word, or phrase sit with you? Come down from the hills, declare the fighting done. Be bold, declare victory, even when the temple is wrecked and the tyrants have not retreated. Only coiled back like a snake prepared to strike again. Come down, try to remember a life gentled by daily acts of domestic faith. The pot set to boil, the bed made up, the table set in calm expectation that when the sun sets, we will still be here. Come down and settle, unlearn the years of hiding, light fires that can be seen for miles, that dance and spark and warm the frozen marrow. Set lamps in the window, declare your presence, your loyalties, the truths for which you do not expect to have to die. It would take a miracle, you say, to carve such a solid life out of the shell of fear. I say, you are the stuff from which such miracles are made. Come down from the hills, declare the fighting done. Be bold, declare victory, even when the temple is wrecked and the tyrants have not retreated, only coiled back like a snake prepared to strike again. Come down, try to remember a life gentled by daily acts of domestic faith. The pot set to boil, the bed made up, the table set in calm expectation that when the sun sets, we will still be here. Come down and settle, unlearn the years of hiding, light fires that can be seen for miles, that dance and spark and warm the frozen marrow. Set lamps in the window, declare your presence, your loyalties, the truths for which you do not expect to have to die. It would take a miracle, you say, to carve such a solid life out of the shell of fear. I say, you are the stuff from which such miracles are made. Please join me in meditation. I say, you are the stuff from which such miracles are made.
We're going to sing a really famous Hanukkah song, this one made famous by Peter, Paul, and Mary Gregory. Hopefully some of you know it and can help me.
So the road to ministry, to formal ministry like mine, is rather long and arduous. There are lots of hoops that you have to jump through and gates that you have to pass through. And back when I was going through this, there was sort of a mid-gate. When you were halfway through the process, you had to go before a committee. They were called the Regional Subcommittee on Candidacy. It sounds as scary as it was. It's this interview, as I said, with about halfway through the process, before about 6 or 7 people. And when I went through it, I decided I would go with a friend of mine who was also a Unitarian Universalist, and she was going to go before the panel at about the same time I was. I'll call her Carol. And Carol was 14 years, she had been a director of religious education. She was about 20 years as a Unitarian Universalist at that time. And at that time, this is about 10 years ago, I had about 4 years on me as a Unitarian Universalist. And Carol was one of those people that I adored her because she was incredibly kind and compassionate. She'd helped me through some really difficult times. And so we thought, okay, we're up in Seattle, we're going to fly down to San Francisco together on the day of the interview. But the thing about Carol that I have to admit that made me, in the back of my mind, a little bit worried about her in this process was that she had ADHD, and she was also a high extrovert, which means she processed everything out loud. And so talking to Carol was a little bit like watching a bee buzzing around. You were sort of like, okay, where are we going with this? I'm not sure. She was also sort of a very nervous person in many ways, and I worried a little bit about her self-esteem. And some of that showed. She was a very emotional person. But as I said, she was also incredibly supportive, kind, compassionate, and she had all this experience. So we flew down from Seattle to San Francisco on the day of the interview, went to the hotel to wait for our turns. And now the thing to know about these interviews is that they rate you on a 5 scale. So 1 means you passed, no problem, you're on your way past that gate. 2 is, we think you passed, but we want you to do something like read a book, write a paper, something like that. 3 is, we got some concerns, and we want you to come back. You don't get to just go on. 4 is, you might want to rethink this as a profession, and we have some very serious issues that you have to work on. And 5 is, I'm sorry, we're not even going to allow you to come back. Now, 5s are incredibly rare. 4s and 5s are very, very rare, but it's not uncommon to get a 2 or a 3. So at any rate, she went into the interview first. She was ahead of me. There were 2 actually committees meeting, so she went to one, and about a half an hour later, I went to mine. And that's a story in of itself. It's actually rather amusing, but I passed, so that was good. So I got a 1, I passed, and I went out to the lobby to wait for her, because she wasn't there, which sort of surprised me since she had gone in ahead of me. So I started to get a little bit worried, and I waited, and I waited. And finally, about a half an hour, 40 minutes later, she came out, and she was in tears. She didn't pass. And in fact, they had serious concerns. They gave her a 4. That she had a lot of work to do. As we left, I was driving back to the airport in our rental car. I gotta tell you, I was just so angry. I was angry on her behalf because, I was like, okay, so she doesn't interview well. I mean, she's a little nervous and she can be a little over the place, and we got up at 2 a.m. to get down here. I was fuming that why this one interview would cause someone with so much experience and so much compassion in her heart to be knocked aside. Didn't they recognize also how incredibly awesome that she was? I was livid. So we're driving back and she's grieving. She's crying. The hurt and disappointment has come over her. I'm still fuming. I'm venting all the anger. And slowly she starts calming down. She starts to take it in. She starts going, well, I guess I have a lot of work ahead of me. She thought about, I did go off my ADHD meds. Maybe I need to get back on those. And there are some things I need to work with my therapist on. I do need to do that. All those things that they had recommended. And she started making plans there in the cars. I'm like, argh. And you know what? That was 10 years ago. And she did it. She went back, she did the hard work, she went back on her meds, she saw therapists, she worked through her self-esteem issues, and now she is a fully fellowshipped minister, a chaplain in the Seattle area. That so impresses me. Because I remember thinking in that car, like, man, if I had gotten that reaction, I'd be like, well, heck, I'm out of here. I'm gone. You can't talk to me that way, I'm not. But she didn't. She felt through her disappointment and her hurt, and she learned from it. Life can sometimes throw us to the ground. It has the ability to feel like it's crushing us. And one of life's mysteries is the answer to the question, how do you rise up after a fall? How do you have the faith to keep going? Faith in yourself, that you're still doing the right thing? Because she didn't give up on her dream on ministry. I want to talk about that mystery of faith, of keeping the faith, right? Faith in this context is really about resilience. How do we have that resilience? How do you keep moving forward when life throws you to the ground and seems to just stomp on you? Well, luckily for me, some of you have actually already done this work. So some of you know Brene Brown. She's one of my favorite authors. She's a social scientist who is studying what it means to live wholehearted lives. When I was on sabbatical a couple summers ago, and you all were invited to read this book with me called Rising Strong. She believes that learning to rise strong after falling down is the way to live a wholehearted life. I agree with her. She says the truth is falling hurts. The dare is to keep being brave and keep coming your way back up and feel your way back up. What Carol did was, to me, one of the bravest acts anyone could do, to wrestle with your shadow and come out the stronger for it. So Brene, she's figured out how we do this. She's studied story after story after story about people who've been knocked down and what they did to rise back up. And of course, she's got a wonderful alliteration around it. It's called The Reckoning, The Rumble, and The Revolution. I love that. So let's look at these a little bit one by one. So the reckoning. The reckoning is when life throws you to the ground, be it feedback on your life goal, or an illness has hit you, or you get fired, or whatever it is, it's to start the reckoning. She says men and women who rise strong are willing and able to reckon with their emotions. First, they recognize that they're feeling something. A button has been pushed. They're hooked. Something is triggered. Their emotions are off kilter. And second, they get curious about what's happening and how their feeling is connected to their thoughts and behaviors. Engaging in this process is how we walk into our story. So one of the reasons why I had in this meditation this morning is to ask you to notice a word, a phrase, or an image that spoke to you. Just that little noticing. Because that's what it can feel like, just like, oh, yeah, that phrase, that emotion, oh, wait, I'm feeling hurt. Whatever it is, it opens you up to that. Listening to what's going on inside of you, taking a moment to really listen. And it's important, though, to understand what emotions that we're talking about. We feel a lot of different emotions. And there are some emotions that actually can keep us from feeling the deeper ones. They're called core emotions. And most social scientists agree that there are these specific core emotions, and most of them agree on what they are. You guys remember the movie In and Out, right? Core emotions of joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust, and excitement are core emotions. In the movie, excitement got put together with joy. They said 5 was enough characters, they didn't want any more. But if you feel any other emotion like anxiety or shame or guilt, or if you just shut down, that's my defense mechanism. I just shut down. These are inhibitory emotions. They're defenses that keep us from the core emotions. This is why noticing is so important. Finding out if I'm feeling anxious about something, what's the core emotion behind that? Because when we feel core emotions, the real ones, there's an amazing miracle that happens. It's like cleaning out the temple. We become more heart-centered. We become calm and compassionate. We become centered. We allow ourselves to feel what we feel. It's only when we stuff down our emotions that we get stuck. Because I knew that there were some issues with Carol. I did. And I didn't want to admit them because she had been there for me and I wanted to be there for her. So I got to be the angry voice for her. This reckoning is probably the hardest part of this process of getting back up. Once you figure out what you're feeling, this can happen in a microsecond, it can happen in an hour, it can take weeks, it can take months, whatever it is, whatever you feel. Then we go on to the rumble. That's owning our story. As Brown puts it, get honest about the stories we're making up about our struggle, then challenge these confabulations and assumptions to determine what's truth, what's self-protection, and what needs to change if we want to lead more wholehearted lives. That's tough to think about the stories that we all have. We all have these stories like, I'm not good at this, but I'm really good at that. And some stories serve us, and some stories don't. The third is the revolution. Brown puts the phrase, write a new ending to our story based on the key learnings from our rumble and use this new, braver story to change how we engage with the world and to ultimately transform the way we live. Creating a new story. So let's look at our 2 stories today as examples of this process. So first there's Carol, right? There's our process. In the reckoning, she felt that hurt and disappointment. That's anger and sadness. She felt it there in the car with me. She didn't block it. She didn't try to go, well, fine, I'm out of here. She rumbled with it. She realized she had told herself stories about being okay when she actually knew that she really wasn't. It didn't mean that she was bad or that she was not going to be a minister, but that she just still needed to do some more work. And the revolution came when she came up with a new story that affirmed her call to ministry while also seeing herself as someone who needed to do some deeper work. And our second story is that of Hanukkah. This is rising strong on a national or cultural level. And I want to point out I'm not condoning violence in any of this. I don't think a physical revolution, I think we're beyond that now as human species. But let's look at this process. Because the Jews at first, they stuffed down their anger and accepted the story that Antiochus told them, that they had to be a conquered people. They had to give up all their stories, their way of life, their culture. And many did actually stuff it down and believe that story. But some didn't. Some felt that anger, the Maccabees. So that was their reckoning, was to realize I have a right to be angry. I have a right to worship the way that I wish. So their rumble was that they got angry and they allowed them to question that story of being a conquered people, because Lord knows the Jews got at it all the time throughout history. But they wanted to question that story, that it wasn't true, that they were a people of faith. They brought about a very real revolution, but they also gave themselves a new story, the oil that lasted them longer than it should have. It's a story that told them that they are a people who keep the faith with their God, and their God keeps faith with them. You know, both of these stories, the personal and the historical, they teach us that no matter how many times you get thrown to the ground, rising again is up to each of us if we're willing to go through that reckoning. And I believe our nation is going through a reckoning of sorts right now. And I might argue that 2 years ago there was a reckoning for those who identify as liberal. And in the last election there was a reckoning for those who identify as conservative. There was reckoning happening around about how we feel about guns and gun violence, about refugees, about immigrants, about racism, and about sexism. We're sitting in the mess of all the emotions that these bring up. And it's going to be up to us to build a new story, to look at the stories that have no longer served us and which ones still ring true. But here's the key ingredient that Brene Brown brings up in her book that I haven't mentioned. The key ingredient to get through this process of the reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. The key ingredient is, of course, compassion. We're not practicing it very well right now. We must have compassion for ourselves and for others in the middle of a reckoning, the rumble, and the revolution. As Brene Brown puts it, she says, owning our story and loving ourselves through the process is the bravest thing we will ever do. Owning our story and loving ourselves through the process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. We must love ourselves and others through this process. You know, Hanukkah, as I mentioned, it means dedication. So I invite you in the season of Advent, of Hanukkah, of the coming solstice and the coming new year, to dedicate yourself to compassion. And then we can build a new story, one that tells us that we are the stuff from which miracles are made. Let us be that brave. Blessed be, and amen.
Amen.